You are no longer a Whitaker, Lauren. Take your fraud and your lies out of this house before I have security drag you to the curb, my stepmother Diane shouted, tossing a forged document at my feet in front of our 60 guests. She stood there in her designer black dress, the grieving widow act finally slipping to reveal the predator beneath. My stepbrother Logan smirked, already swirling a glass of my father's private reserve scotch. They thought they had erased me. They thought a few forged pen strokes could kill my father's legacy and steal my life. I looked down at the paper, then back at them, my face as cold as the silver magnifying glass in my pocket. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply memorized the exact shade of pale their faces would turn when they realized I was not just his daughter, but a forensic document examiner who had been tracking their every move for months. Before I show you how I exposed their web of lies, please like and subscribe, but only if you believe that the truth is a weapon that never misses its mark. And I always want to know where these stories are reaching people, so tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Now, let me take you back to the month before the funeral, when the ink was still wet on their betrayal. My father, Arthur Whitaker, was a man of absolute precision. He built the Whitaker Educational Group from a single tutoring center in a rented basement into a multi-million-dollar empire of private academies and scholarship funds. He believed that education was the only inheritance that could never be stolen. I grew up in the quiet hum of his study, watching him sign documents with a heavy silver fountain pen. He taught me that a person's signature was their soul on paper. It was unique, rhythmic, and impossible to perfectly replicate if you knew what to look for. That was why I became a forensic document examiner. I spent my days under high-powered microscopes, analyzing ink chromatography and the microscopic hesitations in a forger hand. I dealt in the cold, hard science of truth. Our home was peaceful until 6 years ago when Diane Grayson entered our lives. She was a high-end estate planner, polished and soft-spoken, with a way of making everyone feel like they were the only person in the room. My father was lonely after my mother passed, and Diane filled that void with calculated grace. She brought along her son Logan, who was a few years older than me. Logan was the opposite of my father. He was loud, entitled, and possessed a hunger for luxury that he had never earned. From the moment they moved into the Whitaker estate, I felt the atmosphere shift. It wasn't a sudden storm, it was a slow creeping frost. Diane was a master of the long game. She didn't try to replace my mother's memory. Instead, she became indispensable to my father's daily routine. She managed his schedule, his social life, and eventually his correspondence. I watched from the sidelines as she slowly replaced the staff who had been with us for decades. The head housekeeper, the gardener, even the chef, all gone, replaced by people who looked at Diane for their instructions instead of my father. I tried to warn him once, during a quiet dinner in the library. I told him that the house felt different, that Diane was tightening her grip on the company internal documents. He just patted my hand and smiled. He told me that Diane was just looking out for his health so he could focus on the new scholarship foundation. He saw her as a partner. I saw her as a siege engine. 2 years ago, my father was diagnosed with a degenerative heart condition. He wasn't dying immediately, but the doctors told us his time was limited. That was when the shadows in our house grew teeth. Diane and Logan became a wall between me and my father. Every time I tried to visit, Logan was in the hallway, claiming Dad was sleeping or too weak for visitors. Diane started bringing administrative papers to his bedside for him to sign, claiming they were just routine updates for the schools. I knew my father's work habits. He never signed anything without reading every single clause, but as the medication made him drowsy, I saw him nodding as Diane pointed to the signature lines. I remember one afternoon I walked into his room and found Logan standing over my father's desk practicing something on a legal pad. When he saw me, he flipped the pad over instantly, his face turning a blotchy red. He tried to laugh it off, saying he was just taking notes for a business meeting, but I saw the rhythmic movement of his wrist before he hid the paper. He wasn't taking notes, he was practicing the A and the W of my father's name. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I didn't say a word. In my profession, if you reveal your evidence too early, the forger destroys the trail. I needed to wait. 1 month before he passed, my father had a brief period of incredible clarity. He called me into his office at midnight. He looked frail, his skin like parchment, but his eyes were sharp. He told me he knew the vultures were circling. He didn't name them, but he didn't have to. He handed me a small, sealed vial of deep blue ink and a silver fountain pen. He told me that from that moment on, he would only sign the most important documents with this specific pen. He didn't explain why, just told me to keep the vial safe and to analyze it if anything ever seemed wrong after he was gone. It was his final lesson in precision. Then, 3 weeks later, he was gone. The house hadn't even cooled from the funeral when Diane and Logan moved into the master wing and locked his study. They told me I was welcome to stay in my childhood room for a few weeks while I figured things out, but their tone said I was a guest whose reservation had expired. They were no longer pretending to be my family, they were the owners, and I was an obstacle. The day after the burial, the family lawyer Mr. Bennett called a preliminary meeting. I had known Mr. Bennett since I was a child, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. He sat at the head of the mahogany table looking at a folder that Diane had handed him. He cleared his throat and told me that a new will had been drafted and signed only 10 days before my father's death. According to this document, I had been left a small cash settlement of $50,000, while the entirety of the Whitaker Educational Group and the estate were to be managed by Diane, with Logan serving as the executive chairman. I sat there, perfectly still. $50,000 was an insult, it was a go-away fee. But more importantly, the document claimed that I had signed a separate waiver voluntarily stepping down from any board position or future claim to the company, citing my desire to pursue my private career. I never signed a waiver, I said, my voice quiet and steady. Diane sighed, a sound of practiced pity. Lauren dear, we know you were stressed, you signed it in the library the night after the doctor gave us the bad news. Logan witnessed it, we have the original right here. Logan pushed a single sheet of paper across the table. There it was, my signature. It looked perfect. The slant, the pressure, the way the L looped into the A. To anyone else it was undeniable proof, but as I looked at it I felt a cold, sharp spark of professional fury. I didn't need a microscope to know it was a lie. I had never touched that piece of paper. They had used my father's illness as a cover to steal his life work, and they had used my own name to lock the door behind me. I looked at Diane, who was dabbing a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. She thought she had won. She didn't realize she had just handed a professional examiner the very rope I would use to hang her. For the next 2 weeks I became a ghost in my own home. Diane and Logan didn't hide their triumph anymore. They began clearing out my father's personal belongings, tossing decades of history into cardboard boxes as if they were trash. I watched from the shadows of the staircase as Logan took my father's favorite leather armchair and moved it into his new executive office. He didn't even bother to clean the dust off it. He just sat there, feet on the desk, barking orders into a phone to people who had worked for my father for 20 years. I stayed in my room, the door locked, working by the light of a single desk lamp. I had smuggled my portable electrostatic detection apparatus and my spectral comparator from my lab in the city. To Diane, I was just a grieving daughter brooding in her room. To me, every hour was a tactical preparation. I spent nights analyzing the waiver they had given me a copy of. Under a 10 times magnification, the truth began to bleed through. A signature isn't just a shape, it is a series of subconscious habits. When a person signs their own name, they do it with a fluid, consistent speed. But when a forger works, they suffer from what we call line quality degradation. They hesitate, they draw the lines instead of writing them. On the waiver, I found 3 microscopic tremor points in the L of my name. Someone had been very careful, but they had been too slow. They were terrified of making a mistake, and that terror was etched into the paper in ink that had dried months ago. But I needed more than just my own signature. I needed the big one, the new will. The opportunity came 4 days before the 100-day memorial service. Diane and Logan were heading out to a high society gala, the kind of event my father used to hate. I waited until I heard the heavy roar of Logan's new Italian sports car fade down the driveway. The house was silent save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. I knew where they kept the master folder. Diane was arrogant, she kept her victories close. I used a spare key Owen, the old assistant, had slipped me before he was fired. I let myself into my father's study. It smelled like stale cigar smoke now, Logan's scent and expensive cologne. I went straight to the built-in floor safe behind the portrait of the first Whitaker Academy. I had watched my father open this safe 1,000 times. I remembered the rhythm of the clicks, 14 right, 22 left, 9 right. The heavy steel door swung open with a soft hiss. Inside, nestled between stacks of bearer bonds and property deeds, was the blue leather folder. I pulled out the last will and testament of Arthur Whitaker. My hands trembled as I laid it on the desk. I clicked on my specialized ultraviolet torch. This was the moment of truth. 1 month before he died, my father had given me that vial of ink. He hadn't said it, but he knew Diane was manipulating his documents. That ink wasn't just blue, it was a forensic trap. It contained a specific concentration of cobalt and synthetic microparticles that would glow a distinct sharp violet under a 365 nanometer UV light. I held my breath and clicked the light on. The white paper turned a dull blue under the torch. I scanned down to the final page where my father's bold, authoritative signature sat above the date. I waited for the violet glow. I waited for the hidden proof that he had used the pen I gave him. Nothing. The signature remained a flat, dark line. It didn't glow, it didn't react. This wasn't the ink from the vial, this was standard off-the-shelf document ink from a common ballpoint pen. My heart felt like it was breaking all over again. It meant one of two things: either my father had forgotten to use the pen in his final moments, or this entire document was a total fabrication. I turned the page over, looking at the reverse side of the paper. That was when I saw it, the ghost. In document forensics, we use a technique to find indented writing, the impressions left on the pages underneath a document when someone presses down with a pen. I took a sheet of specialized film and a static wand, applying a thin layer of black toner across the back of the signature page. Slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, words began to appear. They weren't from the will, they were numbers, dates. a list of offshore bank accounts and a series of payment installments made to a name I recognized, Mr. Bennett. The lawyer hadn't just witnessed the will, he had helped draft the forgery. The impressions showed that the signature page of the will had been resting on top of a ledger while someone, likely Logan, practiced the handwriting. The pressure was uneven, the strokes erratic. Suddenly, the heavy front door downstairs slammed shut. "I forgot my clutch, Logan. Just wait in the car." Diane's voice rang through the foyer. My blood turned to ice. I was 3 floors up, the safe was open, and the evidence was scattered across the desk. I scrambled to put the will back into the blue folder. My fingers fumbled with the clasp. I shoved the folder back into the safe and spun the dial just as I heard her heels clicking on the marble stairs. I didn't have time to get to the door. I ducked behind the heavy velvet curtains of the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing my back against the cold glass. The study door pushed open, the light flickered on. Through the tiny gap in the curtains, I saw Diane. She didn't look like the grieving widow, she looked annoyed. She walked straight to the desk, her eyes scanning the room. She paused at the safe, her hand reaching out to touch the dial. She frowned, leaning in close. She was checking to see if the dust had been disturbed. My heart was beating so loudly I was sure she could hear it. I gripped the silver magnifying glass in my pocket, the cold metal digging into my palm. "Diane, we're going to be late," Logan shouted from the driveway, his horn blaring. She lingered for 5 more seconds, her eyes narrow and suspicious. Then with a click of her tongue she turned off the light and walked out. I stayed behind that curtain for 20 minutes, even after I heard the car pull away for the second time. I wasn't just scared anymore, I was cold. The kind of cold that comes when you realize the people you called family didn't just want your money, they had spent months standing over your dying father's bed, practicing how to erase you. They thought they were playing a game of chess. They didn't realize I had already moved the board. Before I continue, I have to ask. Have you ever been in a room with someone and realized they weren't who you thought they were? Stay with me, because the next part is where the mask finally falls off. The 10 days leading up to the memorial service were the quietest of my life. I moved through the house like a shadow, barely speaking, barely eating. Diane and Logan took my silence for surrender. They began openly discussing their plans to sell off the Whitaker Scholarship Fund, the very heart of my father's legacy, to a private equity firm. To them, the schools were just numbers on a ledger. To me, they were the children my father had promised a future to. I spent my nights in the basement, where I had set up a makeshift darkroom in an old storage closet. I wasn't just analyzing the documents anymore, I was building a narrative of their greed. Using a high-resolution macro lens, I captured the start-stop tremors in the forged signatures. In forensic terms, these are called hesitation marks. They occur when a forger brain is fighting their hand, trying to copy a shape instead of flowing through a natural motion. On the new will, Logan's hand had trembled exactly 4 times, twice on the W and twice on the K. But the real breakthrough came from a trash bag Logan had carelessly tossed into the garage. Inside, hidden under empty takeout containers and expensive wine bottles, I found his practice sheets. Dozens of pages of high-quality bond paper covered in hundreds of attempts to mimic my father's signature. He had been systematic. He had used a light box to trace original documents, then tried to replicate the freehand motion. I sat on the cold concrete floor, my hands shaking as I looked at the evidence. It wasn't just a crime, it was a cold-blooded assassination of my father's identity. My father had been a man of honor, and they were treating his name like a common commodity to be traded for a faster car and a bigger house. 3 days before the event, I received a visit from Mr. Bennett, the lawyer. He didn't come to the house, he asked to meet me at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. He looked older, his suit slightly wrinkled. He pushed a fresh document across the table. "Lauren," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "Diane wants you to sign this non-disclosure agreement. In exchange, she's willing to increase your settlement to $500,000. It's more than enough to start your own firm anywhere in the world." I looked at the paper, then at the man who had sat at our Thanksgiving table for 15 years. $500,000 for my silence, Mr. Bennett? Or is it for yours? He flinched. She a powerful woman now, she has the board in her pocket. If you fight this, she will ruin your professional reputation. She'll say you stole from the scholarship fund yourself. She already prepared the paperwork, and you'll witness it, I suppose? I asked, my voice as sharp as a scalpel. He didn't answer, he just looked down at his coffee. I realized then that he wasn't just an accomplice, he was a coward who had been bought with the same stolen money. I pushed the NDA back toward him, unsigned. "Tell Diane I'll see her at the memorial," I said. "I have a special tribute planned for my father." He looked up, a flash of genuine fear in his eyes. "Lauren, don't do anything foolish. You can't win against a signed will." "I'm not a gambler, Mr. Bennett," I replied, standing up to leave. "I'm an examiner. I don't look for what there, I look for what missing." The morning of the memorial arrived with a heavy gray sky. The Whitaker estate was transformed. Huge white tents were erected on the lawn, and a fleet of black town cars began arriving at noon. Over 60 guests, local politicians, university deans, and the city's wealthiest donors filled the garden. Diane was in her element. She moved through the crowd in a custom-made black silk dress, her face a mask of dignified sorrow. Logan was right beside her, wearing my father's gold Patek Philippe watch. It looked wrong on his wrist, too heavy and too bright. I stood in the back wearing a simple navy suit. In my hand, I gripped a small leather briefcase. Inside was my projector, my ultraviolet light, and the practice sheets I had pulled from the trash. I saw Owen, my father's old assistant, standing near the catering table. He caught my eye and gave a small, barely perceptible nod. He had done what I asked. He had ensured the large presentation screen on the stage was connected to the house main server. As the clock struck 2, the bells of the nearby chapel began to toll. Diane stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone. The crowd went silent. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice echoing across the lawn. Arthur Whitaker was a giant of a man. He believed in the power of a legacy, and it was his final wish that his work continue through the leadership of my son Logan and myself. Today, as we honor his memory, we also celebrate the future of the Whitaker Group. She paused, looking directly at me in the back of the crowd. She gave a small, triumphant smile. She thought this was the end. She thought the 100 days of mourning were over and her reign was beginning. But before we continue, she added, her tone turning fake sweet, "I believe my stepdaughter Lauren has a few words she'd like to share. Lauren, dear, please come forward." The crowd parted. 60 pairs of eyes turned toward me. Logan leaned against a pillar, smirking, waiting for me to give a tearful, defeated speech that would validate their victory. I didn't hesitate. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking firmly on the stone path. I didn't look at the guests, I looked at the podium. I looked at the folder Diane had placed there, the forged will, displayed like a trophy. I reached the stage and stepped behind the microphone. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and betrayal. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a single silver fountain pen. "My father taught me that a person's signature is their soul on paper," I said, my voice projecting clearly to the very back of the tent. "He also taught me that the truth is often hidden in the smallest details. Diane is right. This is about a legacy, but it not the one she'd been telling you about." I looked at Logan, who had stopped smirking. His face was starting to pale. "Now," I said, clicking the remote in my hand, "let me show you exactly what my father's final wish looks like under the light." The hum of the projector was the only sound in the sudden heavy silence of the garden. On the massive screen behind me, a high-resolution image of the final page of my father's will appeared, magnified 50 times. Every fiber of the paper looked like a mountain range, every stroke of ink like a river of dried midnight. "What is this, Lauren?" Diane hissed, her voice low enough for only the front row to hear. She tried to reach for the laptop, but Owen stepped forward, his arms crossed, blocking her path. "This is highly inappropriate. This is a memorial, not a science fair." "It's a revelation, Diane," I said into the microphone, my voice echoing with a cold, ringing clarity. My father was a man of precision. He knew that in a house full of people who didn't belong, the only thing he could trust was his own hand, and he knew that eventually someone would try to steal it. I clicked the remote, the screen split into 2. On the left was the signature from the will. On the right was a signature from a birthday card he had written me 10 years ago. To the untrained eye, these look identical, I told the audience. I saw the deans of the universities leaning forward, their professional curiosity piqued. But look at the W. In the original on the right, the pressure is consistent, a fluid motion of a man who knows exactly who he is. Now look at the will on the left. I zoomed in. Do you see these microscopic dots? These are hesitation marks. They occur when a forger is drawing a shape instead of writing a name. This W took exactly 6 seconds to complete. My father signed his name in less than 2. This isn't a signature, it's a painting. A very bad one. Logan stood up, his face a blotchy, angry red. "This is insane. You're obsessed. My mother and I have been the ones running this company while you were playing with microscopes." "I wasn't playing, Logan," I said, turning to look him dead in the eye. "I was watching you practice." I clicked the remote again. The screen filled with the practice sheets I had found in the trash. The guests gasped. There were hundreds of attempts, some crossed out in frustration, some circled in red ink. It looked like the notebook of a serial killer obsessed with a single name. "These were recovered from the Whitaker estate garage 3 days ago," I said. "The paper stock matches the high-quality bond my father kept in his study. The ink matches the pen Logan is wearing in his pocket right now." Diane's face was no longer pale, it was gray. She looked like a statue beginning to crumble. "This proves nothing. Anyone could have doodled those. My husband signed that will in front of a legal witness." "Ah yes, Mr. Bennett," I said, gesturing to the lawyer who was trying to blend into the shadows of the tent. "Mr. Bennett, would you like to tell the board about the $500,000 payment that was promised to you for consulting fees? Or should I show them the indented impressions I found on the back of the signature page?" I didn't wait for his answer. I clicked the final slide. It was the ghost image, the black toner highlighting the hidden words pressed into the paper. It clearly showed the list of offshore accounts and the scheduled payments to Bennett, written in Logan's distinct sloping handwriting. The signature page of the will was used as a backing sheet while they planned their payoffs, I explained to the stunned crowd. They were so focused on the lie that they forgot the paper remembers everything. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single person moved. The politicians and the donors looked at Diane and Logan with a mixture of horror and disgust. They weren't just seeing a family dispute, they were seeing a criminal conspiracy caught in the act. And finally, I said, reaching for the silver fountain pen I had brought to the stage, the most important piece of evidence. I walked over to the podium and picked up the original folder containing the will. I pulled out a small handheld ultraviolet light from my jacket. 1 month before he died, my father gave me a specific ink, I said. He told me he would use it for his most important documents. It contains a chemical marker, a forensic taggant, that glows violet under this specific frequency. If this will was signed by Arthur Whitaker on his deathbed, as Diane claims, his signature will glow. I clicked the UV light and held it over the paper. The purple light washed over the signature. Nothing happened. The ink stayed black, dead, and dull. Now, I said, taking a piece of paper from my own pocket. A letter my father had left for me in his safe, the one I had found the night I hid behind the curtains. I held the UV light over it. The signature on my letter erupted into a brilliant neon violet glow. It was so bright it reflected off the lenses of my glasses. "This is my father's true final wish," I said, my voice finally trembling with emotion. "And it isn't a will that leaves everything to a woman he didn't trust. It's a letter to me, telling me that the Whitaker group belongs to the students, not the Graysons." Logan lunged at the stage, his hands reaching for the projector, but 2 of the university security guards, men who had known my father for years, stepped in his way, pinning him to the grass. "Get off me!" Logan screamed, his voice cracking. "It's our house! We earned it!" "You earned nothing, Logan," I said, stepping down from the podium. "You spent months standing over a dying man trying to steal his soul. But you forgot one thing. You can't forge the truth." Diane stood frozen, her hand still clutching her pearls so hard the string snapped. The white beads scattered across the stone path, bouncing like tiny lost marbles. She looked at the crowd, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The grieving widow was gone. All that was left was a woman who had gambled everything on a lie and lost. I walked past her, not even stopping to look at her face. I went straight to Mr. Bennett, who was shaking so hard he had to lean against a tree. "The police are waiting at the front gate, Mr. Bennett," I said quietly. "I suggest you tell them the truth. It's the only thing that might save you now." As I walked out of the tent, the first few drops of rain began to fall, cooling the humid air. I didn't feel like I had won a war. I felt like I had finally finished a long, exhausting job. I looked up at the sky, thinking of my father. I could almost hear the scratch of his pen on paper, steady and sure. The Whitaker name was clean again. The legal fallout was swift and devastating. With the forensic evidence I presented at the memorial, the district attorney didn't need much else. Mr. Bennett, desperate to avoid a long prison sentence, turned state evidence within 48 hours. He detailed every late-night meeting, every practice session, and the exact moment Diane had decided that $50,000 was all I was worth. Logan and Diane were indicted on multiple counts of forgery, grand larceny, and conspiracy. They lost everything. The house, the cars, the jewelry, and the reputation they had spent 6 years carefully building. Logan's bravado vanished the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. He looked small, a frightened boy who had tried to wear a man's suit. Diane remained silent, her face a mask of cold bitterness, even as she was led away from the estate for the last time. As for me, I didn't move back into the big house. It held too many shadows, too many memories of the frost that had crept through its halls. Instead, I oversaw the transition of the Whitaker Educational Group into a public trust. I kept my father's office exactly as it was, but the rest of the building was filled with the people who truly mattered, educators, researchers, and the students who would carry his legacy into the next century. I stepped down from the board once the new leadership was stable. I realized that my father's gift to me wasn't the company. It was the skills he had taught me to protect it. I returned to my private practice as an examiner. There is a certain peace in the silence of my lab. Every morning I sit under the soft glow of my microscope looking for the truth hidden in the ink. I don't look for betrayal anymore, I look for authenticity. A few months later, Owen, my father's old assistant, brought me a small wooden box he had found hidden in the very back of the garden shed. Inside was my father's original silver fountain pen, the one he had used for years before the illness. Attached to it was a small tag with my name on it, written in that familiar fluid hand. No hesitation marks, no tremors. Just the signature of a man who loved me. I realized then that healing isn't about getting back what was stolen, it's about reclaiming the part of yourself that they tried to erase. They tried to make me invisible, but in the end, I was the only one who could truly see. I still wear the silver magnifying glass on a chain around my neck. It's a reminder that no matter how deep the lies are buried, the light will always find them. If you've stayed with me until the end, thank you. This story is for anyone who has ever felt like they were shouting into the wind while the people they trusted turned their backs. Don't let them rewrite your history. Your truth is yours, and it's the most powerful thing you own. If this journey meant something to you, please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on standing your ground when the stakes are highest. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of truth, justice, and the strength it takes to keep your head held high. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, the ink may dry, but the truth stays wet forever.